This is my friend Phyllis. She's going to talk to you guys about her background. She works at the UN on various health projects. A lot of them happen to be in developing countries. And so she's going to talk about where she grew up and her background and her career path, but also about how the UN and how in her job they attack big-time health issues in places we may not think about or diseases we may not think about on a day-to-day basis. Okay.
Yeah. Ooh. All right. Yeah, I just have 2 slides. I'm going to talk a little bit about malaria. But yeah, maybe you guys want to know who I am. I also want to know a little bit about you afterwards. Yeah, I now work at the UN, but I started off being trained as an economist. So I went to school to become an economist, and I studied in Switzerland. And I then joined a consulting firm that has the name McKinsey, and I worked in their healthcare practice. So I worked with pharmaceutical clients and with companies that produce medtech products, so engineering products, ministries of health, and other companies that relate to the health sector, and tried to work with them on their strategic or strategies and how they could either make more money or explore different types of markets. So that was my work, and I'm really interested in healthcare systems, how healthcare systems work. They're complex, but they're very relevant to society. We all want to have access to good healthcare, and in many countries or in many situations that it's not necessarily the case. So I'm attracted both because it's very tricky to find the good solutions and the right solutions, but also because it seems to me meaningful to spend my career in something that society benefits from and needs in some ways. And so in that spirit, after I worked in consulting for some years, I joined the UN, and I now work, so that's the United Nations, which is obviously headquartered here in New York. And I work for a person, and that person is the UN Special Envoy for Malaria. So that's an individual person who is given the task by the Secretary General to help the world eliminate malaria. And so that's my work, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about malaria and one particular project that we've done. But yeah, maybe before I do that, who has been to Africa or has had somebody, have you had malaria?
No, I had to take malaria medicine.
You took prophylaxis? Yeah, where have you been?
I went to Ghana, South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco.
Cool, that's quite a trip. Yeah. Anybody else? Or anybody else with malaria? No? You took prophylaxis?
Yeah.
And mosquito bites? Did you get mosquito bites?
No, I didn't really get too many mosquito bites.
Good. Yeah. Robin, you too?
Yeah, with Tanzania and Egypt, and India. I don't think I got malaria.
Well, I think you would know. You would have known, yeah. Yeah, but so let me talk to you a little bit about malaria. So just to set a little bit the context. So worldwide, what health systems are really focused on, and the metrics we track, have to do with mortality. And we're in particular concerned as a global community about the mortality of children under 5. So that's the metric we are concerned about. And you know, in countries like the US or in Europe, where I'm from, you know, almost no kid dies before the age of 5. Only in really exceptional circumstances death happens. But in developing countries, that's not quite the case. So we have worldwide more than 6 million children that still die under the age of 5. And most of them die either in India or in Africa. And so in terms of percentages, that's pretty high. In some countries, that's as high as 10% of the kids won't make it to their 5th year of life. And so that's obviously, you know, something that the global community is really concerned about. Now, the reasons why these kids die are quite simple, but as such, really shocking. So there's only 3 or 4 diseases that drive these mortality rates, mostly, for the most part. And one of those diseases is malaria. The other 2 diseases are diarrhea and pneumonia, which is even more shocking because, you know, diarrhea is something so simple to treat, and it's not a problem at all in any of our countries, but it's a major cause of mortality, in particular in Africa, and pneumonia too. So so, and then there's obviously a sensitive time around birth in lower resource settings where hospitals are not as good, or sometimes moms don't get to the hospital, so that's also when a lot of deaths happen. But anyway, I'll say that malaria is a really, really important disease because still today, it's, a lot of people get it in those countries, and also a lot of children die. So here you have some numbers. So in 2013, and now the number is a little lower, but it's still really high, we still had 500,000 kids dying every year under the age of 5 from malaria. That's mostly Africa. So that's a really high number, given that we basically have no deaths whatsoever in our countries of that. But the world has already come down quite a bit in these mortality rates around malaria. And even only like 10 years ago, this number was way over 1 million. And so this is already a better number than we used to have, but it's still unacceptable that children die of that. So what the main strategies are, it's basically twofold. One is you can try and prevent malaria so that it doesn't happen in the first place, and then you can try and treat it, obviously. And it is treatable, but you need to get basically a drug. We call these drugs ACTs, and if you take the drug, then in the most cases, you're fine. Prevention is obviously what you try and do in the first place, and so malaria is transmitted by a mosquito. That's why there's a mosquito on this picture, and it's this deadly cycle, which is that the malaria is basically a parasite that attacks your blood cells, and then basically you can't live anymore in the end. But it's this vicious cycle that if you have the parasite and you get bitten by a mosquito, then the mosquito carries the parasite, and the mosquito bites somebody else, and so then infects that person with the parasite that you're carrying. So that's how it's this like human to human transmission, but which happens with a mosquito. And that's why these mosquitoes in technical terms are called vectors. So what the whole world wants to do in malaria is to do vector control. Yeah, I think, Robin, you asked me, like, why, maybe you guys are interested why malaria doesn't exist in the US. Does anybody have an idea, or do you know anything about malaria in the US? Yeah?
Strict control regimens combined with government programs back in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
Along with the fact that most of the continental US doesn't have the climate that malaria likes to live in. Normally it's more like tropical climate, doesn't exist mainly in the colder areas.
Yeah, that's the perfect answer. You want to tell us more about it? How did they do it in the 40s and the 50s?
I'm not good on all the details, although I believe it had a lot to do with lots of chemicals and very strict regimens of monitoring people.
Yeah, exactly. It's chemicals that you can spray where there are lots of mosquitoes, and then sort of the parasite dies from that. Interestingly, Atlanta, for instance, is an area in the U.S. where there was lots of malaria in the past, and what's now the Center for Disease Control, which is a really big government institution dealing with all sorts of diseases, used to be the National Malaria Control Program. So it was also a really big thing here in the U.S., but it's now different. So talk a little bit about the temperature. So what's the thing with the temperature?
Well, mosquitoes in general don't like to live in cold climates. So below certain latitude, it doesn't exist. So malaria follows mosquitoes. It's not transferred any other way as far as I know. That's prominent. So below a certain point, there's no malaria. Like above a certain point, there's no malaria. But then below that point, it's not much of the U.S. is not below that point. So you don't have it as much. Also, you need like wet climates. If it's in Texas, is below that point, but it's also dry. So mosquitoes aren't going to live there either.
Yeah, in tropical climates, yeah. And I mean, really big factor here, while sometimes the temperatures are high enough, but we have ACs in most places now, so we basically almost have like grown out of being at risk. And if you ever travel, like sleeping in a room with AC in a malaria epidemic country is the best thing you can do, because the mosquitoes won't come. Yeah, anybody has a question about malaria? No?
When you
And he
say
will answer it.
when you say like vector control, what does that mean? Like like how are you controlling the mosquitoes? The vectors, yeah.
Yeah. So this is interesting. So here is now how the world wants to solve the remaining challenge of malaria. So as I said, for instance, you try and prevent it, and you prevent it by controlling the mosquitoes not biting you. So the biggest thing that happened in the past was, or is still, is that that everybody's encouraged to sleep under bed nets. So here I had this number of, these are actually, ITNs are sprayed bed nets, and so they're distributed in everywhere all over Africa and the villages, and so people sleep under these bed nets. They're treated with a chemical that was used in the 40s and the 50s, and so that's a way of you not getting a bite in the first place from a mosquito. So that's how you control the vector. But now it gets more interesting as technology and engineering becomes more sophisticated. People are actually trying to gene modify mosquitoes so that they can reproduce. And so that, of course, then means that you change how many mosquitoes we have in the world and reduce the risk of malaria being transmitted. Yeah.
Could you just sterilize all of them? Is that possible?
Yeah, so
with,
that's
like
basically
radioactive, like
yeah.
materials?
I mean, they only live for 2 weeks, so like that would be a major. So you try and modify them in a way that they're basically sterilized. Yeah. And by the way, this is at trial stage. There's a lot of controversy, of course, about that. But that's where technology is going. And now CCAT, just to say, maybe you wanted to say the same thing.
No, mine was an ethical question. Go on.
No, just to say that Zika, which is another health threat, which maybe you've heard about in Latin America at the moment, is also a disease also transmitted by mosquitoes. So now, like the world in particular is kind of interested in trying to explore more this gene modification of mosquitoes.
Ethically, even if malaria is beaten as a disease, same way we beat smallpox in most regions
Yeah.
of the world, isn't it sort of like staving off the inevitable? You have societies where they're outgrowing their ability to feed their own people. So even if you cure them beyond 5 years old and you reduce infant mortality rate, you're only going to, isn't society itself only contribute more to a collapse because you have so many people that you just can't support them?
I think that's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, population, that's a deeper philosophical and geopolitical macroeconomic question about population growth. Where I work in the UN, in the United Nations, in the health sector, we really try and save everybody who has a disease, who should not have the disease or should not die from the disease. But there's a little bit of the question. Of course, at the same time, also what we do in the health sector is part of the excessive population growth we had in some of the developing countries has to do with very high fertility rates. So moms having 6 or 7 children, it's still the average in countries like Malawi or many African countries or Asian countries. And with that comes a lot of risk for moms, there comes a lot of risk for the babies, and a lot of those families not necessarily want all of those children. But because of family planning happen in a certain way, this is the situation. So there's also a big effort in the health sector to try and offer family planning services to those moms and families that want that, so that the fertility rates are not quite as high. So this is a movement that plays again a little bit against the trend that you're describing if you reduce infant mortality. But that's a big important question. Yeah.
What are the environmental impacts of sterilizing mosquitoes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not a scientist to talk about that in detail, but that's exactly the concern that some people have about the gene modification of some of the mosquitoes. Now, of course, you wouldn't sterilize all the mosquitoes in the world because, as your friend highlighted, like in most or many countries, the mosquitoes are not dangerous. So you would really do it in those pockets of the world where you have an epidemic of some sort. So you wouldn't totally disrupt the whole environmental flow with mosquitoes and the rest of the environment, but that's exactly the big question. And I'm not sure, people can answer conclusively. Yeah. So just to say that what the world is trying to do to solve the rest of malaria is this trying to contain the mosquito mosquitoes in a different way. There's also new diagnostics that are on the way. So the symptoms of malaria, you big travelers, you would know probably is fever. So if you do get a fever in any of those countries, you had a bite, or even if you didn't notice the bite, that's a big danger sign. But there are very, very simple tests that you can do, and so of course the world wants to distribute those tests very quickly because, you know, if it's not malaria, it's probably pneumonia, but if it's not pneumonia, so you know, because you can treat it so easily, it's really important you identify it early. So these tests become better and more sensitive, better drugs. We have drugs that, you know, treat certain types of the parasites, but not all types of the parasites. So the drugs become faster, could become better, but also the regimen becomes easier because right now you have to take 3 tablets, and at one point you only have to take 1 tablet, which sounds trivial and unimportant if we think about it now, because, you know, we are used to taking drugs and our moms and dads will pay attention. But if you think about like trying to manage like a large implementation where just the health awareness is of a different sort, it, you know, that makes a difference. Vaccines, we have GSK and another biotech working on a vaccine, and they'll come out, and they probably don't cover again all of the parasites, but they will still be really, really important. So this is why, you know, because there are new opportunities and new technologies in the pipeline in different ways, all the folks in the health sector are really optimistic that you can actually eliminate malaria in the same way smallpox and some other diseases were eliminated before. One important point is the money, as always, and so this is mostly what my work is, being an economist. I work with ministries of health and ministries of finance and big donors. The U.S. government is an incredibly important donor to Africa and the developing countries on these topics. So I work a lot with them to try and steer more money towards malaria in a more effective way, because it is pretty expensive to, you know, to distribute all of these drugs and to treat all of these folks. But you know, what we argue is that, and it is this word return, ROI is what is a return investment. So we're investing some money which feels really high, but in return we get a lot more money back to these countries, because a lot more people will be alive to live a healthy and, importantly, productive life, so they will contribute to the economic growth of these countries. But it's of course a longer calculation, and so one that has, you need to make a case to the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Health to invest now. So yeah, so this is the picture of malaria and a little bit about my specific work. So I work a lot on how does money flows into these countries and how we can get more and how it can be better targeted. So I'll stop again to see if you guys have questions or you want to discuss a particular part of it. Would any of you considering working for the United Nations or the UN? You all being engineers.
You guys don't want to get jobs?
Can you talk a little bit more about your role as an economist in all of this? Like, how do you find the most cost-effective ways, and like, what are your metrics?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, what for all interventions in a health system, so treating malaria, treating HIV, treating pneumonia, treating diarrhea, you economists try and come up with what is the cheapest to treat in relation to the return you get, so saving a life. So there's something that then is called a disability adjusted life year. And this is what economists try to calculate for interventions, but also, and Robin knows this really well, for drugs. And that's kind of then a metric that people try and compare across. So if the cost for a disability adjusted life year is very high compared for a certain drug or a certain intervention, and it's very low for something else, you could make a case that one should invest in the one thing and not in the other. But of course, these are very difficult ethical choices to make. But yeah, we look at which interventions are the most costly or the cheapest in terms of the return we're getting, which is we always look for the life to be saved. And so things like malaria, treating pneumonia, treating diarrhea are incredibly cheap because the drugs cost close to nothing. I mean, diarrhea is not even a drug. You take, you have to drink a lot and you have to take a little bit of zinc, but if you do that, you'll survive. So this costs almost nothing, part of these diseases. So we're a strong advocate for these diseases to be treated. Also because mostly kids are affected. If you save the kid goes on to live a very long life and can be productive. Yeah, so these diseases, that's the thing, these diseases in Africa are actually not really expensive to treat. But the metric we usually use is the cost per life saved.
So, I don't know if there's a right answer to this, but given that we can treat malaria or prevent it in most parts of the world, what mistakes do you think have been made along the way where it's still a problem in Africa and
Yeah.
other countries?
I mean, and maybe that's relevant for you guys as engineers, because sometimes the solutions to these problems are actually obvious, very sophisticated. So we're speaking about gene-modified, mosquitoes, and of course it's a bit in the future, but we have drugs that are very effective. You take it, it's done. You take prophylaxis, you don't get it. So the solutions are there, but the implementation is a really, really big problem. I can only imagine that for some of the things that you're developing, it will be the same thing. Who are the people using these technologies? Are they trained to do it? Do they have incentives to maybe use the thing for something else? Like these bed nets in Africa, they're used for all sorts of things, wedding gowns and fishnets and whatever. So you need to have very strong implementation arrangements in governments that basically make sure all of these people that need a drug or that need a preventative measure get it. And that's where it often breaks down, that, governments and implementing organizations are just, not good managers. And I think we know this from all of our countries, that the public sector is usually not always as strong, and it's even more the case there. It's good to compare to marry your engineering focus with a management degree, I would say.
What new ideas for implementation are you guys working on now? Like from a private perspective?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So one of the things that I actually wanted to tell you about is how also, I'm an economist. I worked in the private sector for a long time, and I'm not a scientist, but because I have an interest in solving these problems, I'm looking for ways how I can bring my capacity and what I've learned to solving these problems. So management capacity is one of those things. So we have set up a big program that works with ministries of health in African countries to try and strengthen their management and leadership capacity. And we formed a partnership with big corporations like GSK and Merck and GE, all companies that are famous for their leadership and management strengths. And Jack Welch, I'm not sure if you guys have seen, but he's this management guru and has led the General Electric for a long time. So these are companies that know how to manage, and really big companies. They have like hundreds of thousands of employees. So you would think that they have a thing to share about how to manage health systems in Africa. So while we don't ask these companies to do that, because that's not their role, the program that I've set up is to try and take the expertise that they have and have them advise the Ministry of Health people so that they, have become better managers and leaders themselves. So that's, for instance, one that is a member state of the United Nations, but the United Nations is many, many countries together. So the US probably spends $10 billion a year on development in general. So that's health and agriculture and education. It's really, really big donor. So this is an amazing part of this country. Yeah.
A lot of people talk about how working in the government is like very bureaucratic and like slow.
Yeah.
Do you find that in your job or no?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the UN is a quasi-government. It's not a government, but a combination of governments. And yeah, there is a big part is bureaucracy. My personal job, because the person I work for comes from the private sector, is my personal experience is not. I don't have a lot of bureaucracy, but that's what I'm observing. That's what I'm observing with the ministries of finance and ministries of health. And so yeah, I think there's a fair bit of that. Yeah.
Any other questions?